Hello again, everyone. Here we are on part two of kind of the postseason wrap up, and I thought what I would talk about this time is how I did some of the NPCs, right? Because I do love me a good non-player character, because while we root for the main characters, we're always a little concerned about them dying or going away or something. Not that apparently it was a big issue in this one. But NPCs hold a particular place where I like to take sometimes the story into a slightly weird direction. You know, not every NPC needs to have a secret or some weird thing that brings them in, but they always seem to have a weird thing that needs to keep them going. Because, anybody who's going to have kind of the adventuring lifestyle, they're not a healthy, normal person. The idea that Yakeem was ever going to be healthy, of course, right out the window. Nobody would sign up for, a juicer augmentation or something like that without trying to process something serious. But with an NPC, you can take a relatively normal person and just put them into a weird situation and allow the story to unfold that way, and the weird is what keeps them going. So I thought, it would be kind of interesting is early on in this, I was trying to use the GME and some of the random tables to help generate non-player characters, which is why for the longest time Jean-Francois just kind of kept gaining and losing abilities until I settled he was just the NPC vagabond directly out of the book. I was trying to do too much and generate an NPC too much on the fly. Now, any setting that is going to be already documented or written, I personally don't try to create an NPC as I go along. Sometimes what I'll try to do is pick an NPC that's already in a book, modify it, give it a flaw or an innate ability that may make it just unique enough, but it needs a motivation to make it part of the story. And given the fact that this is a post-apocalyptic world, having a character who's going to go along with the story sometimes just means survival, right? So right off the bat, I wanted Jean-Francois not to be a combatant. I wanted him, it sounded more like he'd be a little bit of a behind the scenes, and some of those initial roles to try to get personality types, and especially the weird Quebecian French accent that I tried, which I'm still surprised I haven't gotten any hate mail from Canada. I wanted to make sure that he wasn't a rival, and a juicer is going to be in almost like the fantasy D&D idea, like this combination, a fighter mixed with a rogue mixed with a ranger. They have all these super abilities. It's the short candle kind of mentality that makes them so unique and interesting. And so they can take a lot of punishment and they can give a lot of punishment, but they have a hard time without using that burn die to support themselves. A magic user or a psionics user is going to have powers that kind of augments what they already do and allow them to become, like a glass cannon if need be. Juicer doesn't get that option, but they can still be surprisingly fragile. So I wanted this kind of first NPC interaction with Jean-Francois to be somebody who obviously has no business going toe-to-toe with Yakeem, but still had this innate sense of getting into trouble, being a foil a little bit, but at times being able to back up Yakeem, give him, a couple of support roles, a couple of boosts. The big plot twist with him, that was completely out of left field, right? That was just the fate table that was showing and rolling and seeing how the story adapted. And so being able to take somebody, like Jean-Francois, who seemed at first kind of, lovable old vagabond that he was, and then suddenly now, the back history and the setting, the Quebecians are allies with the coalition states who eventually try to, during the kind of like Siege of Tolkien, they see that the coalition states is weaker and they separate. But they still maintain close ties, considering that both groups are effectively human supremacists. I thought it would be kind of interesting there when uh, that die roll when they were in Dodge City, and the kind of like whole branch off that Jean Francois was a coalition spy of some sort. It made his ineffectiveness in direct combat against Akeem make a lot more sense, and it helped make him powerful even if he's not physically powerful. And to me, that's a mark of a good NPC. Not every villain, not every BBEG, big bad evil guy, needs to be the unstoppable tank that the heroes got to wear down. Some of them can just be masterminds behind the scene with plenty of power and the ability to commit subterfuge. So Jean-Francois was an interesting one. I'm glad that the turn occurred. I'm glad that there was a chance to kind of like make him into something a little bit more than just a slightly comedic foil in the background. But, he kind of, there was a real threat that he was part of the big showdown. And I appreciate the fact that the tables kept having him pop up because, quite frankly, I really enjoyed that. Now is when we got to Keith, right? Keith, I had an idea about early on. I kind of wanted to introduce the crazy framework at some point because they are fascinating occupational character classes in the original Rifts. And in Savage Rifts, with the framework, they're just as interesting. They don't have the burn die, right? So they're not perfectly equal with the juicer, but they have psionics. And the ability to throw powers around in the middle of a big, firefight is huge. And I wanted to take advantage of one of the other classes that could feasibly keep up with the juicer. If a juicer runs at a 10, then a crazy runs at a 9 with the chance to really oddball it up. So they don't have in the Savage Rifts player's handbook all of the insanity lifts that Kevin Sabita and the Palladium Rifts group did. So when I was kind of coming up with an idea that I wanted to introduce a juicer at some point, what I did is I started the rolls in the original Rifts version to get the crazy aspect, and then took the crazy archetype, NPC, and just kept those stats. Changed, what the mental hindrance was, and just left the rest alone, which is why she had that really awesome Techno Wizard flaming sword and everything, because, the stats worked. They worked perfectly. Now, one thing that, the whole Tawny Keefe NPC that I don't know if I did it right, was making her an extra instead of a wild card in the beginning. So in Savage Rifts, there's a big difference between the extras, or these kind of like general background mooks, versus wild cards who become a little bit more of like the linchpins of a good story. When I run games and people ask, or I give them, whether they ask to or not, the rules on how to play Savage Worlds, regardless of the setting, I like to tell them that you can play as Keanu Reeves in The Matrix. You could play as Keanu Reeves in Point Break. You could play as Keanu Reeves in John Wick. You could play as Keanu Reeves in, any number of movies that he's in. It's just which style of Keanu Reeves you want to play, because no matter what, he's nearly unstoppable, right? All of his characters, they have a fatal flaw, which is always fantastic because it makes compelling stories. One of the things, especially, I really liked the kind of like monologue at the end of Kill Bill 2, where Bill is talking about how, the difference between Batman and Superman and all that. A thing that I always kind of tack on to that in my mind is, well, one of the reasons that Superman, who is this above humans, metamortal demigod, the reason I'm not a huge fan of the character is because the character flaws are just inconsequential. Like, what does it all mean? What does it matter? Superman can't be hurt. And even when they attack his friends, Superman always finds a way to save his friends. He is effectively flawless. I can't stand that as a character, right? Even if I metagame, I have to build in an absolutely fatal flaw. I need the ability to completely ruin my character at a moment's notice, either through like a bad roll, a bad check, or just the continuous degradation of their psyche. Which is why between the juicers and the crazies, I had a hard time figuring out which one I wanted to start with. But the juicer kind of like limited lifespan kind of tipped that balance for me. But if I wanted Tawny to be much more of a less of a tag along sidekick and a little bit more of a main character to help the story along, she should have been a wild card. You know, the fact that she was taken down in the first fight just by an absolutely lucky roll, which truthfully is kind of the nature of Savage Worlds. But then I had to keep throwing things like getting a Joker gave her a Benny, even though by the definition extras cannot take Bennies. Or, some of the natural healing rolls, I rolled them earlier in her day versus later to try to get her back up in the fight pretty quick. And that's not exactly the way it's supposed to work. I did it for the character and the drama, because I wanted this counterpart to Yakim to roll through what's turning into a pretty lonely portion of the story. And I thought, Tawny, to me, felt like she was an important character. But of course, not making her a wild card in the big battle, rolls well enough, but still manages to take a wound. No Bennies to re-roll those kind of checks, and she's done. She's out. And that kind of hurt. Like, that character death took me by surprise because I was enjoying how, to me, some of those unfleshed ideas that I was having about Yakim in the first place could come out in this combination Tawny and Keith. And I did want them to have, this dual personality. And I had considered rolling to see if she would have even more, but one, that's just too complicated for a solo game. I can only really do apparently 2 voices. And 2, it would take away from the character building of Tawny if she ever switched back. So I thought leaving it as is was a good idea. I still think it was. But not making her a wild card, I think, weakened and took away from where that character could have gone. Now, if she's still alive at the end of the fight, then maybe that Splugorth fight would have been very different, and maybe he wouldn't have been captured, and who knows where the story would have gone. Again, all part of the mystery of how these tables work and the randomness and the, kind of wild card, pun intended, behavior that occurs. But some of the other background characters, I couldn't tell you the name of the Finoti rancher, but I remember distinctly having an image of him in my mind. Picturing that whole like wide brim hat, 10 gallons, walking up wearing chaps and, farmer's outfit and overalls. Practically had, hayseed in his mouth still. I still picture the freshly juiced, lieutenant that was sent along to help Yakim and was trying to lead the fight against the coalition states. Couldn't tell you his name right now. Lee or something? I don't even fully remember. But I still had this picture of almost a like 17 or 18-year-old kid, where the body is outpacing the maturity, right? Freshly juiced, which is one of the edges you can pick early on when you're building a juicer player character. It allows you to have more burn die, but you lose 1 roll on kind of like the veterancy of your character, which makes sense. They just started out. They just did the dumbest thing they could possibly do in their life, and let's go see where it leads them. So for him, I wanted to show that, one, juicers are still semi-superhuman, even freshly juiced. But the other side of it was his maturity level was so low, he didn't really have much in the way of any skills. So I liked the interplay. I liked the way that when Yakim kind of got a little fed up with him and taking the speech and rolling persuasion and rolling crazy high, to me, that was still Yakim's defining moment without necessarily taking away from the freshly juiced, 18-year-old kid. Sometimes these NPCs to me are plot points instead of fully fleshed out characters, and that's okay. Sometimes we, when running a story like this, I can roll like 50 tables and develop a one-dimensional character, or catch just one really lucky adjective and I'm like, that's exactly what I think he's going to be. And I like to try to run with that as much as I can. But I have to remember too, it's okay for me just to come up with a one-dimensional character that's just going to be there for a scene or two. They don't need a name, they don't need a backstory, they don't need to roll on the traumas of their life and exactly how many of their parents died, because of course no adventurer has living parents. If they do, they're an abomination. So kind of coming up with that, to me that kind of felt a little bit more real. Run with the character for as long as it's necessary for the scene. And after I did that, a lot of things started shifting into place for me, right? Anne Ra was a great example. I rolled, there was just a couple of adjectives that I stumped for a second, and then, oh wait, of course there's going to be the Alteran warrior women who just captured Yakim. And of course, one of them's going to have a flaw. What's that flaw going to be? And it showed up as greed. Well, hey, this makes sense for a clone race of bona fide interdimensional killers. There's always going to be variation. And the Alteran warrior women are marked as a potential player character race in Savage Rifts, which is great because they should have been from the beginning. But there's always that, we need to put them into a book where it makes more sense, not less. The idea of putting the greed hindrance in addition to both Death Wish and Overconfident, giving them a role-playing based hindrance versus a potential mechanical hindrance, brings the Xerox copy, there's a not pun intended on a clone race, but it brings the slight deviation for the copies out of the book, which I think is really, that's the way for me to go when trying to generate these things on the fly. Especially something as signature as the Altera Warrior Women, because if you go back and look at the original Rifts cover, there was a reason a lot of us 13-year-olds bought that book before we bought D&D. But I like the way that the background and the story for Anne Ra shaped up, and her sisterhood kind of being one of her tying binds, because towards the end there, I thought, how's the story going to go if, Anne Ra and Yakim escape? There's no love interest. Alteran warrior women are not interested in that. And just as importantly, to me, Yakim was a non-sexual creature. He was asexual because, as he said once, what's the point of sex when you can get high just running through gunfire? And, for the warrior women, again, to me, while they are very heavily sexualized in a lot of the art, the character story is horrific. They are born into trauma. They are born into chattel slavery, which to me is a reason to make sure that they have their own motivations that don't revolve around femme fatale kind of mentalities. The desire to own a home, well, that's just coming from modern living right now. It's kind of hard. So when she and her sister died, that was a little devastating to me. She could not roll over a 1 trying to get out of that dramatic task, and Yakim at that point is broken. I didn't see him going back, despite the fact that earlier in the game, I determined that a couple of his hindrances were that he had a code of honor. Well, code of honor can go out the window real quick if somebody just continuously uses it against you. And so to me, that made a lot more sense. Now, throwing in, for an established setting, legendary style heroes or characters, that one was a little tricky to me. I was a little worried about bringing in Julian the First. One, because what if I accidentally kill him? Now the canon from my game is totally different from the canon of what's actually in Savage Rifts. But then also, am I going to do him justice? And then I realized, of course, it doesn't matter if I do him justice. Would it matter if I brought him up in a, multiplayer game? Would it matter if I was writing the official canon for Savage Rifts? Would it matter if Kevin Sabita hears this and decides to change all the prehistory so that way Julian was always there for this thing? I'm sure I even got the years wrong for when the Juicer Uprising occurred versus the initial attack on Tolkien. regardless, this is my story. And so getting it right, getting it wrong, there's no one who's allowed to tell me that I did. There's opinions, right? And I welcome and am interested in listening to other people's opinions, but that doesn't mean it's going to change how I thought of the story. That said, I thought about bringing in some of the Sunaj warriors, which are a different race and a different style of monster that is heavily related to the Atlantean kind of like mythos and horrifying history. Because one, they're just fascinating characters. I really love the story that comes up from them. I love how it interacts with the rest of the world. But I realized, I asked a couple of fake questions to try to hint towards having it in there. And I realized that it just didn't make sense, right? The fact or the chances for an accidental lore reveal from such a important and pertinent history character without us potentially going directly to Atlantis didn't make any sense. So I thought the Kennel Master made a really good foil. In the fight, the what are they called? Not the Katani, the Katar or whatever. I'll look for that later. It's not that important. I thought those made for good foils for a completely gear-stripped juicer, because he could take a lot of them on one-on-one, but in a multi-way fight, he needed something. But I like the interplay. I like that fight as he was deciding that he was going to escape. The tactics to me from both the Atlanteans as well as, Yakim and friends, even just kind of the interplay between Talia and then An Ra with some of those basic roles, a lot of it just flowed and made sense. And it was an epic fight, so I appreciate that. But to me, that is the way that I want to make sure that I keep doing NPCs. Talia used the stat block directly out of the book. And having the knowledge that there is, of course, a group of evil mad scientists, primate, forced evolution, whatever you want to call them, and even lore dropping the mechanoids, that just came from me being a fanboy. But there's no reason not to be able to throw lore drops like that in and then never let them go anywhere. So, for the villains, sometimes those NPCs, they too do not need to be fleshed out. I think one great lesson I remember reading once is that when you're developing a campaign, regardless of the system, sometimes it's okay for your villains to be one-dimensional. Sometimes they could just be straight evil. That way you feel better about killing them. And then put in the occasional, multifaceted, multi-directional villain that can twist perceptions just enough. Talia was not that. Talia was evil. The Kennel Master was definitely evil. And this was the group that would have said, hey, we're just doing our job here. So the last NPC, the last villain that I put in, the such and such lieutenant, whatever, when they were down in the tunnels, that was just completely random, right? I wanted Yakim to have some kind of boss fight, as I knew that I was ending the game. I knew that his story was coming to a close. He deserved somebody to beat up on. I didn't want it to be an easy fight. It turned into an easy fight because I realized that what's the point of holding on to the burn die? That's just leaving money on the table as you go out. But the idea that the kind of villain was one of the scientists that was there during the whole Juicer uprising, managed to escape, not really red skulling it. I didn't want to give him superpowers, but had a couple of superpowers under his control with the CS Juicer. That I thought was really, really important. I was hoping that it was going to be a little bit more of a drawn out fight and maybe ending in a chase for that satisfaction, but even wounded, Yakim runs faster than the wind, right? So there was no big issue there. The big issue that did come up, of course, was playing off of the hindrance with the Green Brothers sued, and then having him and Yakeem go into a fight where Yakeem just chops him down like a broken tree branch. That one I was a little worried about. So Green Brothers sued. He was the interpretation of one of my first Palladium Rift characters. I think I spoke about this one earlier. Between Sood and Prev, those are my two main, but still in my heart, Rift's characters. And maybe Prev will come up in another one. Green Brothers Sood, though, he was the first time I read the England book. I was fascinated by some of the backstory and lore, this idea that, these millennium trees and all the fun stuff that's in there without me getting into spoilers for those who may not have read it. But to have somebody who may have been ripped from a world but then found their calling was really cool. And so then I especially liked putting him in because here was an opportunity for a character who had been ripped from their world and then found their calling to a character who had found their calling and then ripped into the world. Yakeem had his purpose. It didn't fit him anymore. He went off on crazy, weird adventures. He was almost at a point where he was having a crisis of faith if the JAL was worth following. And in the end, it's effectively what killed him, right? He went looking for answers. And in the course of those answers, he found another group who, in their own whatever twisted idea of trying to help him, put him into even worse danger. Whereas Sood fled danger, came into a world in which he had people that he could now protect. And in this course of trying to find like this pseudo vengeance, just to kind of get him conveniently into the plot story, he found somebody else to help protect. Who then hit him with a double-bladed axe and put him on the ground and still managed to get his scrawny ass taken out. So, between, to me, the difference between Sood and Julian the First, if Sood died, then that would suck for me, right? There would have been repercussions in my personal internal canon and lore that Sood is still out there, roaming the Atlantic Ocean. But if Julian the First died, he still shows up in all the books that have come out, and I'm basing the story earlier in the time frame than where the books currently are. So the start of the Siege of Tolkien is its own character, and maybe I'll get into that into another later one, but I kind of want to leave that too as one of the linchpin story moments that's going to help define where all these stories lay out. That is not exactly current. That is a few years behind where we are supposed to be in the books if you run Savage Rifts directly out of, the first couple of books. There's so much great story that I don't want to give up on it. I would like to experience some of it, but Julian the First is a big part of that. And so now I'm kind of at the scene where there's a real chance I could kill Julian. And the decision by Yakeem to sacrifice himself to get Julian out was as much his decision as it was also this, well, I say his decision, that's still me, but it was my decision to ensure that Julian survived, right? So that way the story could continue, the canon was still in line, and in somebody else's story, maybe there's a plaque or two Yakeem, but the truth was, in the grand scheme of it, he was just one more dying soldier. And there's almost a little bit of a haiku style poeticness to that. And I kind of felt that was important. So I appreciate your time yet again tonight. I think I'm going to do one more of these before I start up season 2, where I think I'm going to talk about the new character, the new campaign, kind of like a semi-unofficial, or maybe it's an official session 0. And I will introduce the Marquis Micah, or Marquis Micah. Yeah. So with that, though, I wish you all a good night.